Thank you very much for joining me on this new lesson for us within the cycle of training that make up the developer program. We're going to be looking now at the introduction to JavaScript within Sage CRM. This is a very packed course, so I'm going to try and cover as much ground as I can within the 90 minutes or so that we've got. And let's put it into some element of context within where we are. We've already started to look within the sequence of training at how Sage CRM makes use of the underlying database and uses SQL for all of its interactions. One of the things that we will find is that as we go forward into looking at the other areas of implementation of business rules within CRM, that we'll see that most of the rules are implemented using some form of JavaScript. I say some form of JavaScript because one of the purposes of this lesson is to start looking at the fact that there are slight variants as we go through. And so this lesson is very much about looking at the core of the language and getting you to understand some of the concepts around this, so that really sets the scene for us to then start looking at how we can use JavaScripting within workflow, within ASP pages, or whatever. Well, it doesn't matter really whether your skills are focused on development or whether you're a system administrator who just need to be able to cut and paste JavaScript from a blog or from another source and to be able to adapt it for use within Sage CRM. A lot of the points that we're covering here, I'll just make sure that you're on track and you understand what's going on as you're using this. So JavaScript is used throughout Sage CRM, and this is a diagram that we're going to be meeting again and again and again. It's really all about reminding us that as we come to using Sage CRM, what we're using is a browser-based application, that as we make a request from the browser, so there are events occurring inside the server that cause the HTML of the interface to be generated and returned to the browser. Now, here we have got an opportunity of where if I make a request to go into a particular screen, and here you can see we're just starting up the server, but if, for example, I now make the request to go into the company screen, you can see that I've added some code in here that causes a little message to display as the screen occurs. Now we need to be able to understand, where is that code executing? Is it executing on the server or is it executing within the browser? And of course we can have a way of passing code from the server to the browser, and that's going to be one of the fundamental things. But the point is, where is the code being executed? In this particular case, we can see that this is basically firing an alert onto the screen, and so this is executing within the context of the browser. But when we are dealing with this, we realize that there is code that sometimes is fired on the server and sometimes code that is fired inside the browser, and we're going to be looking at the differences between the two. Because although we'll discover that it's the same language that's used, the objects that we're using are going to be somewhat different because of the environment in which we're working. Now, just as we start to get going with this, can I give you a word of warning? When we're talking about JavaScript, do not let yourself accidentally call it Java. So you're not working with Java at all, you're using JavaScript, because the language of JavaScript has nothing to do with the language of Java. The two only share 4 letters, and that's the only thing. It's really much more common. It has much more in common with C or C++ or even C#. And so the origin of JavaScript goes back to when it was first developed by Netscape in the early 90s, and actually it occurred more or less at the same time that Netscape included the the ability to run Java applets within the browser, and consequently it owes more to marketing than it does to technology, the name JavaScript. The language originally called JavaScript was then handed over to a standards organization called ECMA, now called ECMA International. Rather strange, that sort of name, because ECMA originally stood for European Computer Manufacturers Association. Now it's European Computer Manufacturers Association International, or rather it's just ECMA International. And they look after the standard of the language, because of course there are different browsers that make use of JavaScript, and JavaScript is not just about code that is run inside the browser, it is also run inside the server as well. We use JavaScript within the context of ASP pages, but there are other server-side Java based implementation like Node.js, which indicate that JavaScript is a server language just as much as it's a browser language. And JScript is another term that you might hear as you're working with the documentation and as you're working with examples. And JScript is Microsoft's name for their own implementation of JavaScript, although you will find now that most people just call it JavaScript, even inside the Microsoft products as well. Now, it's not the only language that we can use inside Sage CRM. Different languages can be used inside Sage CRM and around CRM for different purposes. It's just that JavaScript is the most commonly used language. And if I flick over here and look at something like a simple ASP page that I've got here, where I am referencing an external file and starting to work on this, if I drill down and look at the include files, and I look at one of these include files for sage.js, and here you can see that in this particular file, its principal job is to declare the language that is to be used by ASP pages. Well, don't worry if you don't understand what I mean by this particular declaration and what that's doing. We've actually got a lesson which is going to look specifically at ASP pages a little bit later on within the cycle. But you can see that sometimes we have to implicitly we'll be using JavaScript, but sometimes we'll explicitly state that we're using JavaScript, but it's still the same common language used throughout. Now, some of the places where we implicitly use JavaScript, and in fact this is true for all of the server-side code, is if you look at within the product. If I go over to something like the administration screen and look at customization at the company screen, and look at where we've got some behavior in the company box long, and I look in one of these fields, for example, I wonder whether I've got some code in here. No, in fact I haven't. I'll tell you where I will have some code is if I go into the cases screen and I look at the example here, the case detail box, and I look at the SLA severity or SLA ID field, SLA severity field, and you can see here that I've got some example JavaScript being referenced inside the validate script. Now, whether you understand exactly what this JavaScript is one thing, and we'll be looking and trying to unpack JavaScript in a little bit. But what we can see is that the create script and the validate script and the onChange script are writing, allows us to write JavaScript in there. Then the JavaScript is executed in slightly different locations. Remember what I was saying with this chart, where we've got the breakup of where the code is either executed within the browser or executed inside the server. The validate and the create scripts are fired inside the server. It's only the onChange script that is fired inside the browser. And an example of a very simple onChange is if we go into the example of the address field, and I log on and I go on as a sales user, and I jump across to look at my company, and I go across to look at my address field. And I look at a particular address and I start entering in a postcode, and you can see that it capitalizes that particular postcode when I move off the field. So I entered in a string all in lowercase, I tab off and it moves it into uppercase, and that's a product, as we can see here. If we go into the customization of the address field, and we'll see that this is expressed as an onChange rule. So if I go into the screens, go down into the address box long, and then look at my address code, and we can see that that's there. We have a rule expressed here on the onChange. That rule fires within the context of the browser, and it's actually very clear that it is changing and having its effect inside the browser. Now that will affect the language that we write, but let's explore other types of rules that are implemented within the server and within inside the execution environment of the EZ02 DLL. Because it's really the EZ02 DLL what is responsible for driving this execution, although it will be referencing the Windows scripting engine within the server. So it's actually reaching out and running the script externally. And here you can see that if I go back to the level of the customization of the tables, and here go into company and look across into table level scripts, we would be able to define inside here some JavaScript that if we wanted to use it. So we can put in here the concept of, or code associated with the concept of, an event. Now we'll be meeting the concept of functions a little bit later on. Here we have some event functions, and they're specific types of functions. These are called event functions because their behavior is invoked when something happens. Now an event inside JavaScript is triggered associated with a particular action. Now that's either an action within the interface, as we see here when I enter a value and tab off, that's called the onChange event that's taking place there. And we have other events that can take place, for example a click event, or we can have an event that's associated with hovering over a particular value. So here if I go into the listing of opportunities and hover over this, you can see that that's another event that can be triggered within inside the system. That's all behavior that we can take advantage of within inside the system, but there's also events that Sage CRM adds in, which are not particular to the browser so much as to the way in which Sage CRM is designed. And the table level scripts are examples of these types of events associated when a record is inserted, or when a record is updated, or when a record is deleted. And we can think of these as analogous to database triggers, and they're really moments that we can then insert our own code to carry out actions that we want. We'll be looking at those in a later lesson within the cycle. We've also got the possibility to look at JavaScript that has been added in associated with workflow. And if we come over to the workflow area, and we can see in here I've got an example workflow that is one of the examples that can be downloaded from the community site, and this is the new opportunity workflow. And if we look at the rule quotation sent, we can see in here that there is some JavaScript that has been expressed. Now, if you ever see JavaScript like this and you're thinking, hey, that looks a bit unreadable because it's all bunched together, and let's actually have a bunch of reading this, it doesn't look particularly pleasant. Now, there are a number of websites to help us read and get sort of better information out of this. This is where we can take advantage of sites which are either going to compress JavaScript or space it out and beautify it. And one of the sites that I use is this site called Closure Compiler, and it's on appspot.com, and it means that you can just paste in some code and you can say, I want to pretty print this, and I want to do it with white space only, and compile, and what it will do is it will return for me better spaced out or prettified print. Now, there is in fact another site that I also use for this, and this is JS Beautifier. So JS Beautifier you might actually prefer, because it allows you to paste in the code that you've got and then just do a Control Enter, and you'll see that it spaces it out so that it looks a little bit prettier. There's more than one way of laying out the code, and you can see that there's one way of writing the equivalent of the same code, and I'll do some explanation as to why things have been written out in that way in a moment. That'll actually be quite a good idea when we come on to deal with some of the brackets. Okay, so those two sites, jsbeautifier.org, and you've also got the Closure Compiler. These are useful little reference sites that will help you unpack some of the code that you might find. And one of the codes that you might find and you might need some help with is around the component manager. The component manager itself is the tool that is used for when we want to add in some customizations within the system. So if I go into administration, customization to the component manager, it's here actually that I used a component to deliver the changes into CRM, which added my new workflow. And if I go into the component details and I actually have a look at that particular component and preview its script, what we can see is that we've got a whole series of changes that are being made into the system. So you've got a lot of changes that I can add in here, and that's all good. And we can see that this is a nice way of working. And that preview may not look like JavaScript, but it is in fact all expressed. That ES file that would be created, the script file for the component manager, uses JavaScript as well. We'll actually find that when we come to do some work on the component manager a little bit later on within the cycle, and we end up doing some conditional behavior and handling of parameters that are passed from the parameter screen of the component into the actual script file. Now, there's another place where we will be using JavaScript in order to implement rules, and this is actually a really exclusive area. You have to use JavaScript, and you have to be comfortable with using JavaScript in order to implement the rules, because there really is no other alternative. With the case of something like the component manager, you could just do potluck and just record it and accept the way it's generated, and without having to make any alterations. But with the advanced email manager, because you want something to definitely happen in a particular way, you actually have to write that, and you have to express that through the use of JavaScript. If we open up one of the samples that we'll be using, and here I'm coming out of CRM, going into the services where I will find the script files that I used, we can see that there is a support.js file in here, And if I look at support and open this up, we can see that this is JavaScript that is written out here. And you might not immediately tell that it's JavaScript, but I can tell that it's JavaScript because it's using JavaScript variable declarations, and we can see that it's got functions that are being defined in here. These happen to be some event functions before the main action and after the main action, which are not doing anything, but they're standard functions which are existing there because they're always invoked. And there we can see the create case, and we can start to see references to objects and passed in values that are being referenced. Now again, once you've got going with the main language of JavaScript, a lot of this will become clearer, and like anything, you've got to start at the shallow end and start gradually easing your way into working with the JavaScripting environment with inside Sage CRM. Let's look at where else, though, we might find ourselves using JavaScript with inside Sage CRM. We've seen that we use it for the explicit rules that we define with inside the create script, validate script, table level scripts, with inside workflow, and with inside the email manager. But we also find ourselves able to define JavaScript simply by adding it into the browser within the custom content, and that's actually the vehicle in which we'll probably do most of our experimentation in this lesson. And I can see that if I go into my company box long, there I've got in here a little function being used that is declaring my hello world. So that function that we can see in here, and which I'm clearing out for now, you can see I can just express as some JavaScript. Now this is mixed JavaScript, as in it makes some use of some special API calls that we provide within the context of Sage CRM. But that's okay. I'll be explaining a little bit more about that in a moment. But that custom content allows us to add in optional script into the interface. Now you'll see that in my HTML tag, and script is an HTML tag just as much as something like emphasis or span or bold is an HTML tag. You can see here that script it doesn't have any properties associated with it, but in fact we could have declared the language that we are using. It's just that the browsers all implicitly assume that it is JavaScript that's being used and not any other language like VBScript. So that's the optional place where we can add JavaScript into the interface, and we can also add JavaScript into URLs. By anywhere basically where we can add in a URL and call a URL, we can put in some JavaScript because we can make use of what are called pseudo URLs. This is something, if I come up here and type in JavaScript in here and say alert hello and just hit return, you can see that I'm able to put into the browser JavaScript hello, and it's executed that little bit of code. Well, it didn't do much, but it proves that just as a browser URL can be entered in there, you can put the same idea of JavaScript within any place where you would normally express a URL. We can also in here, if we look at the way in which we extend CRM, we'll be using JavaScript within the ASP pages, and that's something that is very important now within the new integration environments that we're going to be using. So anyone who's going to be integrating with X3 will need to get used to scripting and editing the scripting around X3 using JavaScript. And anyone who wants to work with self-service will be working with ASP pages and JavaScript and expressing that in JavaScript. It might look a little bit old-fashioned, but in fact it's really quite up-to-date and modern it's still fresh in allowing us to do a very wide range of very clever things within our product. Even within application extensions which are written in .NET, we can still use the blocks, and then still everywhere within inside the environment of those .NET pages, we can still be delivering in code that is then executed, JavaScript code which is executed within the browser. And of course there are other programming options in and around the product. I've just mentioned .NET, and if you're writing .NET, you might be writing it in C#, or you could possibly write it in VB.NET. But you could write your VB web services in any language that you like. It could be PHP, or it could be Java, or it could be C#. You see, whatever you do as far as your choices are concerned, from a development program point of view, it's pretty clever to make sure where you're going to get the best help from. And I have to say that we're only providing, although you can do anything, any color you like, any color you like so long as it's black, you can work with any language you like as far as our APIs are concerned, but you'll only ever get examples provided in JavaScript and C# within the SDK and community. It's maybe a little bit harsh, but that's the way that it is, because that's what the most common requests are for, and that's what we use internally. So we've got JavaScript and C#, loads of examples in order to accomplish a wide range of different rule implementations. And as we go forward into looking now at not just where the language is used, but what does it look like, we're going to consider here syntax and the available objects. Let me just do a quick check to see if anyone's lost and baffled by what I've said. I'll just jump across into the panel, and it looks like no one is in distress at this point, so good. I will keep going. Syntax and available objects then. All right, JavaScript has a basic syntax which is common whether you're writing an ASP page, or whether you're writing an advanced email manager script, or whether you're writing simply a rule on the on change within a field. But where you're writing that code will really affect just what other objects are available to us, because it might have a core syntax, but it needs to reference the surrounding information. It's a bit like the analogy that I used this morning is a bit like knowing English as your core language as a person, going to school, finding yourself going into a history class and coming up new concepts and needing to deal with things like constitutions and battles and having to meet philosophical concepts like liberty, or actually concepts like succession, and then walking out of that history class where you've used English as the language of discussion, but within a particular context you've had new nouns and new verbs which are meaningful in that one context, moving to another class perhaps like biology, and there finding you're using a whole set of new nouns and verbs like meiosis and mitosis, and discovering that you might hear the same word like succession, but it's used in a particular meaning in the new context. And so this is a bit like JavaScript in that regards. So you might find the core language being used in an ASP page or in a browser, and you might even see familiar methods and things, but in fact they're different and they mean different things when they're used in these different locations. So objects that are available to us depend on where the code is run, and that's something that we need to get familiar with. The idea that if we're working within the browser, you can't use the same objects in an ASP page, and if you're working in an ASP page, you can't use the same objects within inside the internal script. Good. Well, now let's start to get to grips with JavaScript and come in and zoom in on this. First of all, there are some basic rules, and in the basic rules, I would, if you want to go and spend some time, I reckon W3 Schools is probably one of the best places to go and hang out and learn more about JavaScript usage. General plain old JavaScript. JavaScript is case sensitive. If we look just at these 3 lines of code that are here, we're going to be meeting, and this is, by the way, 3 lines of code would actually just about write a page with inside CRM. It's a little bit of a simplification, but that's good. Here we've got the meeting of the declaration of a variable. We're seeing that we're declaring our variable using the word var. This is an example of a keyword. Keywords inside JavaScript are all lower case, and if you're working with an environment like Visual Studio, what you'll find is that they're coded blue typically. There's a sort of more or less a convention as to what these things start to look like. So keywords are all in lowercase. Then you can define your variables in any way that you like. Now, JavaScript is so case sensitive. If I wrote ID in capitals, it would be different from if I wrote it in lower case. And then if I reference the object CRM, the CRM is uppercase inside the ASP pages, but if I write it inside the browser, CRM is referenced in lowercase. There's a convention about how the objects are referenced and their casing as to where they are. They're different objects, and the language works in a slightly different way. Server-side objects tend to be uppercase or initial uppercase letter. And here you can see with CRM dot get context info, camel case in the way in which get, then C, and then I of the info are written out, and then you've got the method passing in company ID. Now, in there, you've got in get context info something that is called the method with 2 parameters being passed into it. You can see that company, comma, company ID are in quotations, and they're being separated by a by a comma. These two items are parameters being passed into the get context info method. This chunk of behavior that is being called actually passes that to the database. And I could have written company in uppercase or company ID in lowercase, and it wouldn't have cared, because one of the paradoxes is that, and if we think back to what we were doing earlier on within the database work, I could write select star from company, or I could write select star from company, and it wouldn't make a jot of difference as to which way I do it, because the database is not case sensitive, whereas the JavaScript is. So my block, when I reference my block, which is the object name that is being created when I retrieve opportunity list from the database, it doesn't matter if I put opportunity list in capitals, it will find that unique block called opportunity list and then instantiate a variable called my block. Watch the case there, and I have to reference it called my block inside here. Now, a lot of the code that I'm doing, I've been doing using a text editor. I would strongly advise to use, if you are a relative beginner, when you're working and evolving your code, using here the idea of a Visual Studio or a visual development environment, because this will eliminate some of the problems of creating a new variable. So this is my data equals hello world, I write this, and now when I start typing, it should start to tell me that my data is here. So I've defined it. So it's a way of eliminating the problem of mistyping my variable names. So that's one tip that I would share with you. Okay, so how do we start to write our code? Well, code that you cut and paste, and let's see if we have got any code that we can cut and paste on the community. And let's have a look at hide button. You might find some code that we might want to take. There's some code. It's not particularly nice code, but it's not particularly nice code at all. That's all old code. There must be a better code example than that. Buttons, buttons, buttons. There we are. Oh, still this is bad code. This is all. Oh no, I'll do. Hiding a button. So here, for example, I've got some code that I might want. Now, this is very fulsome code because it's needing to take into account the browsers, and I will simplify my life a lot when I come on to doing a little bit more work with this, in that I won't need to do that. But here's the code that I've written, and you can see that I've got fulsome code being written out here, and I've just copied and pasted. This is the sort of thing that people are doing all the time, and what you'll find is that it consists of a series of statements, and it's also got function definitions within inside here. You'll notice that we've got some code that has been commented out. It's got comments explaining what the line is doing. So comments are a very important part of this, and they try and show us what we want to do. But within the general writing of any of the code that we have, you'll notice that that we have this idea of a statement. A statement is a bit like a sentence which makes sense on its own and should really end with a full stop. Inside JavaScript, the full stop is provided by the semicolon, and this is actually quite a good example because I'm showing how bad I am because I haven't included a semicolon at this point. Now, sometimes statements actually go on beyond a single line, like an if statement, because an if statement is really a guard for the following line or set of lines. Now, in this particular case, the if statement is acting as a guard to this particular statement, which is the window.attach event. Now, here, again, I've been very remiss in not putting a semicolon at the end, but each statement is typically ended, but you might also find that you have got a compound statement where you are grouping things together within inside curly brackets. So statements can be embedded within other curly brackets, and you can see the way in which those exist. We'll talk more about the idea of compound statements in a moment. But all of this layout actually is not important to JavaScript. All these tabs and indents are not important at all, because we can pick this up and I can take this to something like the closure compiler service and put this in here, and I can say close up my white space and compile it, and what you'll see is that it compresses it into the minimum amount of code needed. So this is a safe space-saving facility. It's one of the things that you will find if you ever look at the JavaScript within inside CRM, the generated code within inside the header. You'll find that it is all compressed and the white space has been removed. HTML as well is something that tolerates a lot of white space removal. So white space is ignored, tabs, spaces, etc. are only there to help you in your readability of the code. It's not there for functionality. Now let's start to construct some code, and we can start going with a hello world to meet our idea here. Now this is my simple hello world at the top. This is where I'm writing out some variables. If you don't believe me, I can comment this line out and we can start to do this again, but basically we've got str message 1 and str message 2 defined as variables. I can declare my variable str long message is equal to, and those two variables. Now what I'm doing here is showing you that I am writing and constructing two variables and then creating a third variable by referencing the other two items. Now these two variables consist of a declaration, which you can see that I've declared my variable formally by using the var. This is a good idea generally. It's a good idea rather than implicitly. We can see as well that I've provided it with a name, and the name is distinct, and we can see then in this case that the variable is being assigned with an equals a value, and the value happens to be a string. So I've now got two string variables that I am then concatenating into a third variable. So I'm actually, not only am I declaring a variable, but I'm also declaring and assigning within a single statement. When it comes to writing things out, if I want to do some work, then I can introduce you to the idea of a method. So if I do a document here dot write, this is a plain old JavaScript method of doing this. I'm just writing out my long message, and I can pick this up and I can go into my CRM. I can go into the company box long, and I can go to where I might put in some custom content in here, and you can see that I can write in script, and I need to put this into a script tag, otherwise JavaScript will not be able to tell it apart from simple HTML. So it's contained in there. The scripting engine within the browser will know then to execute it as script. So once it's saved, I can come into my company summary screen, and we can see that the hello world has been written out into the screen. Now it writes it out in the flow of the execution of the page, so that's been done very, very neatly, and that allows us to introduce this concept of something that contains behavior that does a particular job within the environment that it's in. So document.write, for example, there are things that we haven't defined. It's been defined within the context of the environment that we're writing the code, and we're passing our objects into that particular method that is provided by the environment for us. But document.write also is particular to the environment, and we'll see that in a moment. But as I said, we've gone ahead, we created a variable, we provided it with an identifier, so it's got a variable name. We'll meet other identifiers associated with functions in a moment, and we'll also start to look at what we can use for naming of our structures. Now, it says there you can use underscores and dollars within your name. Just be very careful that if we find ourselves looking at example code within inside the system, we will find that dollar is more or less, be careful about using it because it's referenced and used extensively by a library that we include within Sage CRM called the jQuery JavaScript library. So it's a library that simplifies some aspects of working with JavaScript. It abstracts it and hides some of the complexity of having to write lots and lots of codes. So here we've got the idea that we can declare our variables. We've got a whole set of different keywords, and I've just included those on the right hand side so that you're aware that there are obviously some reserved names. You can't go around calling your variable new or export or do when actually they're reserved words. We can go ahead though and declare our variables as and when we need them. So basically they don't have to be declared at the header of a document or anything. You can declare them as you use them, as you can see where I've just actually declared and assigned all at once, because variables in JavaScript are what are called loosely typed. They are loosely typed to the extent that somebody who's come from a background of using a strongly typed language like C# can end up tearing their hairs out because it seems such an undisciplined way of working. But that's just the nature of JavaScript. It allows us to be fairly loose in what we do, so we can actually declare as one variable and then end up treating it like another one. So here you can see the example given of where x can be declared to be 1 and it is treated therefore as a string, as a numeric, and then later on I could override that and say actually I'm calling it hello world, and now it becomes a string because it's containing a string. And you can declare in quite a wide range of different ways. So you can declare without assigning a value, declare and assign at the same time, and here you can see that it, just as I did earlier on with concatenating the string to form a new value, you can actually concatenate or carry out calculations in the assignment, or you can declare a whole set of variables all within a single statement. That's the idea of the var abcd or var abce. We're going to meet as well that when we come on to variables, it depends on where you've defined them. We're going to meet this concept very much in environments like the idea of the scripts associated with the advanced email manager, because so much gets passed into the overall environment, and here you can see that we're passing in and declaring certain base variables which are useful, and then you'll see that there are functions which will reference those same variables within inside the system. So if I point out an item like case person ID, I should be able to go and find case person ID, and we can see that this example of the code actually is contained within inside the function here, which I think is going to be called new case or case tracker. Still quite a lot of in here, somewhere in here, there we are, create com actually. Create com, it is being used. So this is an example of where we need to be able to declare a variable outside a function and have it passed inside the function. This is the difference between something that is local to create com and something that is global. Here you can see this variable called saddress is defined inside create com, so no one else, it's private to this function, whereas This code, as we saw here, this case person ID was declared outside of the function, so it's public or global. In the case of JavaScript, it's called a global variable. So global and local, you can sometimes call these as public and private variables in C#. Okay, so we have there some important concepts about variables. Let's see the types of data that we can store inside JavaScript as well. And we're going to be hitting numbers, we're going to be hitting Boolean strings, arrays, and objects. We'll be meeting all of these. And in the case of using these, what we have to start to do is to realize that there are some things which are the same and there are some things which are different. Just before we do this work in the data types, let's look at an environment here. And if I look at my page here, we're starting to see that I've done the same bit of JavaScript, but then I'm using it differently. So I've got a response.write. This is just pointing out that the usage of variables doesn't change depending on where you write the code, but the objects which are available to you do change. And so response.write works very differently. So if I click on this simple, this is calling this simple hello world.asp page that I've written. That's the page we can see in here. All it's doing is it's writing out this message of hello world, and in my case that is literally all that it's doing. There's no furniture, no menus or anything like that being added into the page. It's just writing out the text hello world just by calling from the menu, and that's the response.write, which is the object contained within the ASP environment, which is invoked as we use the interface. Now we'll be looking at ASP pages a little bit later on, but what we can't do is use the document.write. Now we used document.write earlier on when we were writing our code that was executed in the browser, but this is code that is executed inside the ASP page, and the ASP page doesn't know about document.write, because document.write, it forms part of the object model of the browser rather than the object model that is part of active server pages. Different location. It's like talking about meiosis in history. It doesn't make sense. Okay, well, we talked about the different variable types, and just as I talk about this, I just want to double check that no one is throwing in the towel and screaming at me. Document.write is a method specific to JavaScript and not specific to, say, CRM. Actually, no. Document.write is a method specific to the browser implementation, the document object model of rather than JavaScript itself. So it is something available to JavaScript. It's nothing to do with Sage CRM. It is everything to do with how JavaScript works inside a browser. So any program can use that. Okay. Does that? Okay. Now with numbers, as we come on to numbers here, one thing that again will cause some people to tear their hair out is that JavaScript doesn't distinguish between an integer, a whole number, which is a whole complete number, and a decimal number. It just regards numbers as numerics and uses a 64-bit floating point format, which means it just allows very, very large numbers. Perfectly useful for all of the transactions that we might want to do with inside both CRM and integration with an accounting package. So numbers are held just as they are, and you have the big decision then of saying, is something a number or not? If you try and treat a variable as a number and it's not a number, then there would be an error returned which contains a special value, which is a not a number, NaN, but you can deliberately test to see if something is not a number by using a method called isNaN. So you can look for the fact that it's not a number in order to catch you out. Now that's important because otherwise you cannot tell what the object is until you look into it. And another thing that we need to look at is the idea of booleans. Now booleans are used inside CRM all over the place. Here you can see if I go into administration, go down into workflow, into advanced customization workflow, and down into my little workflow rule that I have here. This quotation sent. We can see that what we've got in this example, and I'll go into the online beautifier to do this and paste this in. We can see that we are declaring valid to be either true or false. So valid here is a Boolean variable. Actually, valid is something called a system variable, which is used for a very specific purpose inside Sage CRM. That's something that we will see when we are starting to do our server-side scripting in the next lesson. But valid here is a Boolean. We can check to see whether it's true or false, but there's other places inside the product in which the usage of a Boolean check is not explicitly, is it true or is it false? And by the way, you can see here we're assigning valid to be true or false. We're not testing to see whether it's true or false. But one of the things that we can do is implicitly check to see whether something is true. If it has a value, if it's literally true, we would test for equivalence. But one of the things that we can do is to look to see if an object has integrity. In the example code that we might write, and here I look at a little bit of example code and look at my example here. Let's go and put that into my code. If I paste that in here, what we can see in this function that's being used is that we have got an implicit check for a Boolean value. We have got where we've got a find record to look for information that satisfies a particular criteria, and we're returning a cursor object, which is actually called a record object inside CRM, but basically it's potentially a record set that is being returned, and we are checking to see whether we are at the end of the file. If we are not at the end of the file, then of course we must have some data there. So this is a not check, and basically it's using a Boolean type check, because if it's not this, then it's false, and so we can do the next bit of checking. We'll be meeting this little function again because of the use of the while clause, while statement there. But that's the idea of Booleans. Booleans are used implicitly mostly inside the examples that we use inside CRM. But what we've done here by looking at strings so far and looking at numerics is allowing us to set up and come across a little bit of a conundrum. Here I've got the conundrum, which is how do we handle numbers and strings together? So we've got var x and var y both being declared, as you can see here, as a numeric, and then you've also got an arithmetic task being carried out where we are adding those two together. And we can see that there would be the ability to mix the arithmetic with the string information. Does that generate an error? Well, let's actually do this. So if I come into my little environment in here, and what I'm going to do is say var x equals 3, var y equals 2.5, and then I'll say, what do I want to say, var z plus is equal to x plus y, and that's the end of that. And then what I'll do is I will then write that out. So I'll say a document, document dot write, and I will write out this is the answer Z plus. Okay, now this is, you're probably looking at that and saying, screaming at the screen and saying, I know what that is. I know that's so easy. And it is perfectly easy, but it's worth doing this just to act as a little bit of a reminder to us all as to how easy it is to be caught out when dealing with strings and arithmetic. So here, this is what it looks like, where we are just saying document write, this is the answer Z plus, and if I save that, and once it's saved, I can go and refresh this page again, and we can see that this is the answer 5.5. Well, 5.5 is brilliant. That is the correct answer, because that's that is the result of adding in 3 to 2.5, and that's 5.5. Now, what happens if I change this so that I actually do the arithmetic within the same line, if I don't have this intervening stage? So if I comment that out and I do this, what happens to me here? So if I put my code in at this point, we will see that we get caught out. And this is the sort of thing that, especially when we're building calculations and we're building strings that we want to send to a database, that we can get caught out by, and we end up returning silly information from the database. And here, what this now is doing is it's telling me that the answer to 3 plus 2.5 is now 32.5. And the reason being is that, of course, it does this in strict order of the definition that I wrote. So it actually concatenated those and then concatenated that to that. So it just increased the string in length. Whereas if we want to treat these two arithmetically, we would either have to do an intervening stage, or we would need to use the idea of brackets to force the arithmetic behavior in between these two brackets before we concatenated the two into the string. Their standard arithmetic type rules will apply. You might remember BODMAS, brackets off, multiply, add, subtract is the order in which the rules would be applied. Now, we are needing to keep pressing on because we've got lots and lots to discuss, and I want to move away from talking about these rather simple objects of the numerics and the strings and the booleans to more involved objects. Now, within inside JavaScript, arrays are a type of object, functions are a type of object, dates are a type of object, and objects themselves can be built to hold its own structures that we might want. We can build things like associative arrays, for example. And what I would be very cautious about doing, though, is to talk specifically about dates, for example, in this lesson. Dates, I think, deserves almost its own lesson, so I will just mention that this is one of the inbuilt objects that we can use to create our own behavior with, and we've written, there are plenty of blog articles which talk about dates. But what we'll do here is look at how we can start to construct and use our own objects within the context, specifically within inside the browser. So we're going to come on to look here at the use now of what's something called the document object model. Now if I go into CRM as a user and I'm looking at my company in here and I look at something that I'm interested in, like the company name, I can right mouse click and I can inspect the element. You can see that this is one of the features of the browser that allows me to do this. All browsers have their own developer tools. This happens to be Chrome's developer tools. And what you can see is that I'm looking at an individual field which happens to be a span ID within inside the structure of inside the structure of the page. The pages are slightly the pages are generated differently depending on whether we are inside a view mode or inside the form mode. So I'm just going to close that, now change it into edit mode and do the same thing, same field, inspect, edit, and this time we see that we're looking not inside the span but inside the input. Now the reason I've changed over to look into the context of our field in edit mode is that it becomes much clearer that we're dealing with an object in the form of the input field that belongs to a form. We are very obviously dealing with a form inside the HTML page, and we're looking at a document inside a window. You can saw the fact that I use the document.write. And this is the way in which the document object presents us with a way of modeling all of those inputs, all of those structures in a programmatic way, rather than just looking at it simply as a big massive string which we then have to parse. We actually can look at this as a series of objects in relationship with each other, so that we can say, well, I want first of all the overall window. Within that window I want to reference the document. Within the document I want to think about all of the forms that might be in there, and the first form that's on the document. Within the form I want to reference all of the fields, and specifically I want to find a particular field. So you can see that the document object model allows us to get to any of the individual ideas through the idea of there's being a conceptual structure of the page. And we can go down into each of these HTML tags and HTML structures and reference different properties and different methods to allow us to control what's going on inside the page. Now there are equivalent object models available for whether we're dealing with ASP pages or whether we're dealing with the internal CRM environment written inside a create script or a validate script, and we'll hit those a little bit more when we come on to those lessons. But let's start to look at a specific example within inside the screens, and we've already glanced at this in here. If I go, close this down, and go now to the addresses tab and look at an address, you can see, if I right mouse click and inspect the element, that I can go and look at an individual field. Now I can also look at the zip code field, and when I inspect that element, what we will find is that it also has another property, not just the class, the ID, the length, etc., but it's also got an on change. Now this is where the code inside the system gets implemented inside the interface. It's implemented as the on change method, or it's on the on change event, to provide the code that we want to use. And what we can see is that we are writing this bit of code in the context of the object. Now there's an alternative way in which we could phrase this same bit of code. And if I demonstrate this, we can see that if I go onto what's called the console, I can start to reference the structure. So I could go down here document.form and into form 0 I could reference then an input and so on. I could do all that, but actually because there's a uniqueness of the name, I know that I can go and say comp underscore not comp address underscore postcode. We'll see if I just type postcode here, you'll see that it returns the chunk of the HTML. It recognizes that that's what it is. And if I look at postcode.value, you can see that it recognizes what the current postcode is. And if I want to set it to be a different value, then I could set the value to be test postcode, and you can see that it sets the value of the test postcode. What I'm doing here is using the document object model to know, if you go back into the elements, that it has a unique name, so it's identifiable inside the structure. It has a property called value, and so I can then access the object by its name and then set its property and assign it to what I want it to be. And it's confirmed that that's actually done. Now it's not saved anything in the database, I'm only mucking around with inside the browser at the moment, but this is proving this particular point, and we now know that if we look at the value, we can reference it and we can see that it's a string. We can see that it's in this quote, so we know that it's a string. So if it's a string, we can start to perhaps do string-like behavior with it. So what would happen if I said var my string, or string, is equal to address postcode dot value. So I now have my string, which is test postcode, but if I say to uppercase as a method, we can see that we can change it to uppercase. So I could write this in an interesting way. I could say address postcode equals value equals my string dot to uppercase, and I can set it, and you can see it's both set it here and it's also set it up inside the screen. So there's more than one way of implementing and carrying out the work, but it's resting on the same idea. But the reason why it looks like it does, if I go to the elements, and we can see that it says it's this value equals this value to uppercase, is that I've got this little bit of code in the context of this particular structure, which is the object, which is the field, which is called address postcode. And there's a keyword inside JavaScript which says, well, if I'm writing this inside the function or inside the object and I'm setting this value, I don't have to name myself. I can just use this idea of this dot value or this something. and then the property. And that's what's been done here. So you can see this is one way of expressing it, and that's because I'm inside the object as the code is written. So the object was a string there, and that allows us to access all of the different inbuilt behavior associated with it. And these objects like numerics, these objects like strings, once JavaScript understands the object to be like that, it opens up all of the behavior for us that we can start to use. Now I've just used there a very simple on-change script, and that's an example of when behavior is triggered as an event occurs. There are all sorts of different events that can be added into the browser items. From version 7.2 onwards, it becomes easy to actually add your own events inside the full environment of the browser. That's something that is probably a little bit out of scope of any discussion in today's lesson. But what we do need to understand is that as we're writing and doing anything here, you can just see as I flash around the code here, it's just changing and highlighting different things. I have full access to anything inside the browser now with my code. I can access anything in here, anything that's declared in that is on the drawn HTML served up. And that actually includes within the objects of the browser the ability to make AJAX requests back into the server. AJAX is asynchronous JavaScript and XML requests, basically using an object to go and carry out an asynchronous look back into the database to fetch additional information. Now we can do other stuff as well. We can change the document object model. We can do lots of things. We can add in things like pseudo URLs into button actions to cause JavaScript. One of the things that we need to be aware of is that JavaScript is actually used within the default button functions. So if I look at what we've got here for the save button, and I copy a link address on this, we can see that in the link address actually it's a pseudo URL that's being used. A pseudo URL is the jargon word inside to describe a URL that isn't really a URL, and like mail to is a pseudo URL, or phone link is another one, like Skype has a fake pseudo URL, and here you can see that JavaScript is using is another registered pseudo URL. That indicates that it's not really a method that's going out onto the internet, but it's one that is local to the browser, so the browser understands that keyword in a very particular way. Okay, the next thing to look at is to see how we can start to build our scripts. I'll just do a little bit of a check as to where we are and where we are within the cycle of training. We've got still quite a lot to do, but I just want to make sure that there are no unanswered questions. No, I'm not going to expand my I'm teaching the principle here, Michelle, not quite exactly everything. What's Shani's asked a very interesting question. What is the benefit of using custom content in CRM as opposed to having the JavaScript embedded in the ASP page? It's really to do with maintainability and separation of code from structure. Logically, really, any ASP page that you write, and here if I open up an actual page that is doing some work with inside CRM. So if I go into CRM 73, look at a custom page, and then down into something like panoply list and panoply list.js, this JS file is called and embedded into this page. What we can see is that this page is concentrating just on the delivery of the structure of the page, and we're using a block here called panoply list. Panoply list would have a metadata definition which would include a custom content block. The custom content block could then include the JavaScript that is executed within inside the browser. The advantage to us is that we have separated the code that needs to render what needs to be generated on the server in order to generate the HTML that is sent to the browser. That includes the reference to the files which might then be called into the browser to further change the information. If you want to, by basically not having the JavaScript that is executed within the browser inside this code, I've made a much simpler environment for myself. JavaScript be easily seen and altered by the browser. How do I protect my database from being manipulated by a clever user? Well, your database isn't going to be manipulated by a clever user, really, because you're only changing visually what's going on with inside the browser. You're not changing data necessarily. I say necessarily is that there's a possibility that you could invoke some web services to make changes, but that's a different kettle of fish, and a user can't actually do work that they don't have the permission to do anyway, because you would still have and any manipulation takes place within the database, you would still have the security policies in place. JavaScript is all about rearranging the fields, putting the fields where you want, putting messages on here, hiding a field, not because the user can't see it, but because the user doesn't need to see it at a particular point. If the user should not be able to see it, then you would hide it using a security policy. So from a application control point of view, none of the things that we're looking at the moment is all about challenging data integrity, but we are all about implementing business rules which create a consistent and good user experience to make sure that the user doesn't go around entering in poor information or wrong information. So something like our zip code, for example, here, my test here would be backed up, typically within a full production environment, if you're thinking about the design philosophy, with another check to make sure that that data was in uppercase. It just means it's brought forward the checking of the rule into the interface rather than leaving it until I hit submit, in which case the data gets sent into the database. That unexpected event that occurred has happened because I've timed out with inside the interface, not because I've been tinkering around with that. Okay, that's should be, yeah, because that had timed out that particular item. That lock had timed out. Okay, if I go back, open up my, it's in the JavaScript console. This was the code that I was writing. I'm not sure I can tell you much about this. I don't know which one you wanted to look at. It's gone. now. So this was what I'd been doing, the idea of refining the particular code and then using the idea of setting a variable and then knowing that I can play around with setting that variable to uppercase, and then I put the two together by saying what I want to do is to set my variable to be my string to uppercase. That was the code that I wrote, Michelle. Okie dokie, let's keep going with this. We're coming on to really looking at the at a point where we need to start moving away from simple plain old JavaScript and bringing in, from just a ease of use, some of the client-side API that was added within version 7.2. If we have a look at some code here, if I write some code in my little simple page, let's go to the end here, and I'm going to write script in here, and I'm going to say window dot alert hello world. And I realize I've just written this at the bottom of the screen where you can't see it, so let's actually move this up so you can see it. And that's my little bit of code. Just I'm writing out hello world. Now if I go as a system administrator into my company box long, and I paste that in here into my custom content, I'm going to see a message which writes out hello world onto the screen, as you can probably guess. But it's going to fire and interrupt the load of the page. You'll see this just here if I click on my summary, and there you go. It's interrupted the load of the page. Now it's interrupted the load of the page because the code is read as the page loads and executes as it comes across the code. So JavaScript is an interpreted language. It's reading the entire page. It finds this page. It executes this line, and we have to respond to it, and then it carries on with the rest of the load of the page. But what if I don't want it to interrupt the load of the page? What if I want the page to load and then to display the message? And this rests on this idea, this constant idea that we've been bumping into, which is the idea of the event. When this has been done, do this. When this occurs, do this. This is the event idea. On change, we've seen an event, and we also bumped into the idea of the event inside the server code when we look briefly at the table level scripts, at the idea of when an insert takes place, when an update takes place, we can do this. Well, actually, there's an event for when the page loads. And if we were to do this inside the browser, if you're working with something like Internet Explorer, then you would use a method called attach event to do this. If you're working with a browser like Firefox or Chrome, then there's an inbuilt event called add event listener, which allows you to attach the event on the load or the onload. Now, this is quite important to realize, is that even the mechanism for attaching behavior is different between different browsers, and the event that occurs is different between different browsers. This is a cross-making experience for us. It can be very frustrating from a development perspective, because now we're adding in and the thought of a new browser coming along, which is Edge. So does that have the same mechanism? Well, what we've done is to work along the same lines as the JavaScript library called jQuery does, and abstract this test as to which browser we're using to worry about adding the behavior. And the client-side API gives us a method that we can use. So if I insert a snippet here into my code snippets, Sage CRM client side, and I look down here, there should be a nice ready example. There you go, ready. This ready example shows us that actually what we can do now is just to move our code into the function that is executed by in this circumstance. So I don't have to worry about which browser I'm doing this in. I just can use the idea of this CRM ready method that invokes a function that contains our code. Now, this is obviously building on the idea that we need to understand what a function is, but we're coming to that. But we need to look at the idea that sometimes functions are extremely necessary within the context of what we're doing. And if I go into my company box long again, and I look down into my code, I can replace my single line here with this function reference. This CRM ready is principally going to do the job of putting it on to the moment when the page has loaded and is ready for the user to use. So I've saved that. And then I can come back to this and I can click on my summary page, and this time you'll see that the page has loaded and then the alert is brought up. So we can see that this way we get the message displayed once the page is ready for action. So this is going to be a very important thing that we use again and again. It's one of the places where we're starting to move away from plain old JavaScript to using the library, essentially this API, this application programming interface, which is provided by CRM to simplify your experience of using JavaScript, because otherwise you'd have to take into account which browser you're using by doing it this way. So much more verbose code. Now, we've obviously been using the developer tools to explore the document object model, and that's something that I would encourage you to access and play with, pressing the F12 button and to opening up the developer tools, both the exploring the elements and exploring the console, to be able to test and try out JavaScript within the interface. But as you're looking around the code, if you'll find that much of the code is labeled and provided with very clear IDs. Now, IDs are very useful things. If I come into the code again, if I look at this field, right mouse click and view the page source. Oh, I didn't mean to do the page source. I meant to right click and inspect the element. We can see that this element has got a name in that it's got an ID where, there's a difference between names and IDs. IDs are what we want. IDs are the good mechanism that allows us to spot and identify items easily and uniquely within the structure of a page. And they provide us with a shorthand way of going straight to an item rather than having to navigate through the document object model of checking to see what the contents of a particular item is. We can go straight to it and know what it is. Now I can show you what I mean by that is that within the document there's a mechanism that says get element by name or get element by ID. So if we look at get element by ID and I remind myself what that element name was, which was our datacom name, in our JavaScript that we write, if we use get element by ID, that allows us to grab hold of that information. And if I say var my field equals get element by ID, we can actually start to do some manipulation of that. Now, if let's just roll this down to here, I can say dot in here dot inner HTML or inner text. You can see I can read the contents of that field. Now, if I can read the contents of the field, can I actually set the contents of the field? Now, this is obviously only changing it for the purposes of display. It's not changing anything in the database. Please note this is not changing anything in the database unless somebody, there's no submit capability within this page. But that allows me to change what's shown on the screen. So you could actually do very clever things. It's opening up the capability of knowing how we can read the element. So we've got the field, so we can get hold of something. Now imagine that happened to be something like a URL. Now what happens if I where it's got website at the moment, if I provided a path to an image, I could actually rebuild and say that Wibble is actually not going to be Wibble, but it's going to be an image tag with a source equals let's have a look at Donald. Oh, let's have a look at Donald Trump. Let's have a look at Donald Trump. Let's have an image of Donald Trump, and there you go. I just like his comb over. So here we can have his copy his image URL, and if I paste that URL inside here, it's a very, very long URL. That's a horrendous URL. That might be a bit too long. That's horrible there. Let's not do that. Let's see if we can find a better one. Let's have a look at, instead of Donald Trump, let's have a look at Donald Duck. And images for Donald Duck. And let's see if we've got a copy image URL. What's that length of image like? Oh, another horrendous one. I want a nice short one that's used in a blog. Let's see. Let's have a look at copy image URL. That's a bit better. There we are. So I've got a nice image here. If I put my source in that and I close my tag, you can see, oops, I've managed to get a nasty injection. It hasn't done that. That shouldn't be doing that. Okay, it's not wanting me to do that because it thinks I'm actually injecting some text, but that's all right. If it was on my own server, I'd be able to get away with this. So I could put my own images that I want. That's actually probably quite a good error to have, because it's just reminding us that I can't just go willy-nilly adding in, injecting paths from other servers onto my own screen. That would otherwise end up a possibility of causing all sorts of problems. And if I look at this image path, That's a bit better. So here, where an image exists on my own server, I should be able to go back here and it's still objecting to that. That shouldn't actually be image source. Ah, right, image source. Oh, that's why. Nothing to do with the injection. It's to do with there. It's not evaluating it. Oh, why is it not evaluating it? Never mind. Okay, so anyway, I'll have to think about why that's not evaluating it, because it's not because I've turned it into text. That's inner HTML. There's another property called inner HTML, and we can see that I can change it there. So that inner HTML, I think even I should have been able to get Donald Trump or Donald Duck displaying there as well. HTML. Not quite, but let's. There we are. Donald Duck is now displaying on my screen. Not particularly well sized, but he is displaying on my screen. I can basically change and use JavaScript to allow me to fetch off information from elsewhere to change how I'm displaying that screen. Okay, let's see. I'm sure somebody has thrown up some comments on that particular topic. Right. Do you have to use ready? Will testing for browser still work? Thinking about legacy code to upgrade with simpler code. No, you can certainly carry on, and you can use the testing. So if something is moving from version 7.1, for example, to version 7.2 to 7.3, you don't have to use the CRM ready mechanism. You can leave it and still use these testing for the browser mechanisms, because they're still supported by the browsers. So you don't have to change it. But if you are, it's possibly a good idea to review a site, because the chances are, if you've got a lot of code that is browser dependent code, you may want to think about building into the project some form of basically refactoring. So it just simplifies things from a support perspective longer term. Now we've looked at this idea of using things like inner HTML, and using the idea of being able to read this to change the information that you can read from a particular field, because this ID field is very, very important. Used in a lot of places inside CRM. If you can find the field or structure, you can change its inner HTML, you can change its text as well. And good idea to be able to do that. Now, as we're starting to get more complex, we'll want to start to think about constructing objects and compound statements that do work all together. And this is where we need to start thinking about our code, which we might be expressing through if statements and while statements and conditional behavior. Basically, I'm saying, why are brackets, curly brackets, important? If you consider this code on the right-hand side where it says if open brackets crm.mode equivalent to, the equals is the test for equivalence or test for equality view, you can see that the job of the if statement is to guard access to the next statement. But there are two lines of code there, and the if statement would only guard the str message equals hello world. It would not guard the crm.mode. If both of those bits of behavior need to be conditional on the evaluation of the test of mode, then what you need to do is you need to put that inside a compound statement. And a compound statement is bracketed within inside these curly brackets. That means that both lines of code are treated as a single unit. You're grouping them together and saying these are guarded by the preceding gatekeeper. So if satisfies that, you then do the compound together. And it's a very important idea. If you don't have that, then you can run risk. Now, perhaps I should have put these slides a little bit earlier on, but these are when we are meeting all sorts of different symbols, and we've been doing some of this work already because this is starting to introduce us into the arithmetic types of behavior that we can do. I've just used simple addition so far, but obviously there's the multiplication that you can do with the star sign and division. A lot of this is very familiar to people who have been working with spreadsheets, and so there should be no problem with these. You can see the usage of increments and decrements as well, and this is all nice and logic within that. But there are also assignment operators that we can use that can short circuit our assignment of what we're doing, and we can see here that we can say the two that are most commonly used are the first two lines where we've got the operator of equals. That's a plain simple assignment, but we also have the additional assignment where we can say x plus equals y allows us to say, well, x is equal to x plus y, and that's commonly used. You'll see a lot of that. And there are other assignment operators as well which are less common as well. Okay, so we know if about that, and I've mentioned about the implicit use of the Boolean test earlier on. This is just written out in a little bit more plain text, as we can see that we're using a method of the CRM object in order to look into the database to see which context we're in, and it's looking specifically to see whether we've got the company service level agreement ID. If that is null, and you can see that we are trying to declare and assign the SLA ID variable all in a single statement. If that comes back as nothing there, then when we come to reference it within the if statement, we can test to see whether it has a value, it has been populated with a value, or whether it is null. This is an implicit Boolean test, and if that exclamation mark is saying if it doesn't exist, or if it's null, then, or undefined, then what it will come back as it's saying that this company does not have a service level agreement. But if it was true, if it had a value, then that would fail that particular test, so the company would have a service level agreement. So you can see that we can test for falsehood just as much as we can test for truth. I've talked about the if then else, the importance of the if statement guarding the following statements. You don't have to use an else statement. It's very useful to be able to do that, and in certain circumstances around, say, for example, workflow, it's a recommended practice that the if statement would have the else with it as well. We know about declaring strings within JavaScript. If you're using strings within JavaScript, can I point out that you can actually nest strings, and you would need to do this, for example, if you are building a where clause that needs to be sent to the database and you're needing to pass in string information. So imagine that string argument variable here has been declared as containing comp underscore type equals, in quotes, competitor, close quotes. That's an example of where we're nesting. But generally, strings can be declared inside JavaScript as being either using single quotes or double quotes, but nesting is allowed. Just to point out that if you do want to include within a string that you're defining a quote, then you'll need to use the escape character to do that. And of course you know about the concatenation of strings as well. We're going to be looking at regular expressions a little bit later on in the course, because we'll use that when we're both using on-change and validation rules, just to compare and contrast the use of regular expressions. But here, for example, you can see the usage of the concept of a regular expression using the idea of a regular expression object. There are different types of inbuilt objects within JavaScript to allow us to define a regular expression object, which is a string, looking at the pattern of return code, and we can then see whether another string contains that particular sequence of letters. Now, if it does, then we can carry out the behavior that we want. But regular expressions are used in a lot of places within CRM, and I would encourage you to go in and have a look at the community. So I'm swinging around here into the browser to have a look at regular expressions, and we should be able to find that there are articles written in here about using regular expressions. So we've got business rules for text fields, for example, inside here. So you've got lots of different examples as to you may want to express and how they particularly look for those. These are very simple match expressions. But regular expressions can also be used to ensure that as you're entering data, it's automatically changed into the correct pattern. So you can use it as a type of entry mask as well. Okay, that gives a simple example, but as I said, there are plenty of examples that are on the community site as well. Well, what I want to talk about now are the idea of arrays as mechanisms within JavaScript to allow us to hold sets of information that can then be returned. Generally speaking, data is not returned in CRM as an array that you would then want to work, but arrays are typically structures that you might want to use in JavaScript because the browser itself returns objects within arrays. So if you ask for all of the inputs or all of the fields or all of the spans within a particular document in JavaScript, then that's chances are it's going to come back as an array, and you need to be able to work with the idea of an array. Here you can see arrays work on the basis that they have a declaration in which you can declare it either as an empty array to which you would then add an item, or you set the array up with a dimension of number of elements that you expect, or you can add the items into the array as you declare it. So you've got different ways in which you can do this, and the array allows us to be able to reference the elements by number, and so it is only a number. Inside the client-side API, some of them need to use string manipulation with arrays disappeared. For example, I'll show you a sort of typical type of string manipulation that used to take place inside the screen. And here, if I go into where I am looking at contextual information, we can see that what I'm doing here in this bit of code, let's just enlarge this. This bit of code is for reading the information that is passed within the query string. This is within an ASP page, and it allows us to read the information passed in to allow us to access all of the information there. Now, one of the things that might happen inside a query string is that the same variable is referenced multiple times. And that's one of the things as you move around inside CRM that could happen. And what we are able to do is to work out and split, if there is the case that there is a reference of it within inside a string, we can actually go ahead and split a string up based on the position of a character. That splits it into an array which we can then start to process. And you can see that this is, in this particular place, ID array is created by splitting a string based on the use of the comma separator. So that's a type of usage of where an array is used and how you would then start to reference it. We've got a simple example here of constructing an array to hold a set of different values which you would then reference and use when the page is being loaded. So this gives an example. Now, one of the areas that we will meet is when we're writing and constructing our own advanced bits of behavior of functions. And here I can think of a function which is a typical function that you would find defined within inside CRM from a business perspective, is one in which you would want it to perform a fairly standard task. And this is the idea of something like checking the case within a particular screen. Now this check case screen works a bit like this. If I pick this up and put this into where we've got the person screen, so if I go into this is where I've timed out, so if I go into admin, I've timed out. So if I go into the administration screens for the person, so if I go into customization, looking at person, and then down into the person box long, I can put this custom content in here, and then I can I can enter this on a field like the person screen to say this dot value, is equal to check case this. For some reason I seem to have butterfingers. This dot value. So check case there is being used on that field to check the correct capitalization of the data. And I can jump across into the system, log on, Susan May, go and have a look at a person like Simon Yaltoy. So if I go into Simon Yaltoy here and click change, I put the behavior on this field. So if I type in Yaltoy, all in lowercase, you'll see that it capitalizes it correctly as I move off. Now that rule is using the idea of a function which encapsulates all of this behavior. So we've got in here, we know what this is. This is a compound statement, and this is a label to say that this is the shorthand way of accessing all of this behavior. So if this is the idea of a function, is an object which encapsulates and names and labels all of this chunk of code. And we can see that it's got a parameter. Now x here is a variable that is declared locally inside this function. So x is not a global variable, but rather it's a local variable to this function, which means that if we do some string manipulation, which we're doing, we want to be able to pass the value of the reformed and changed data back out, and that's why we have a return value here. It's passing it back out so that we can then take that function and assign it the product of that function to the code that we've got. And we see its usage actually when I wrote that line, when I wrote up here, this dot value is equal to check case this dot value. So this dot value was the parameter that became x, and it then returns x, so I can assign the return value of that function to my variable here. Obviously, you can only return one value from the function. Okay, so other things that we might find as we're looking at CRM is that we might see occasionally within code with statements which are really about simplifying the type of behavior that you'll see. And with is, I don't think it saves much work really. You can see on the right hand side the equivalent of the with statement on the left. Just keep mentioning the word my block a little bit more because you're being explicit about that. Probably saves you a little bit more when you are working with a very large amount of properties within a particular object. Do and while, these are two separate types of loop. I've already looked at a while loop, but I'll explain that actually first. If we go to where I had this code, we've got a while statement checking to see if a particular condition is true. So this while is all about checking whether something is the case. Then we perform an action, and we include in this another action which is deliberately designed to change the data that is being evaluated. So this is the check. We do our action. We then change the evaluation data to see whether that is going to be done again. So this is a loop. A while loop is a loop. We're caught in this loop until this no longer is true. If we didn't have this next record changing the data, in this case moving us through the record return results set until we potentially are at the end of the file, if we didn't have that, then we would never leave the loop. So we actually have to think about a while loop as something that we may not enter the loop because this actually may not be true, but once we're in the loop, it will keep doing this until this changes the data, which means that this is no longer true. That's not quite the same as something like a do-while loop. A do-while loop will always do the first set of actions because the check at the end is only done afterwards. So it will always do the first run through and then subsequent checks. And that's just one of the nature of the do and the do-while. For loops are used extensively inside CRM, especially when you are moving, or CRM code, especially when you are wanting to process sets of data where you want to just process them automatically. So if you've got a select statement, for example, and you want to start logically moving your way through those, then you can do that with a for loop. So for each of the items in something, in the case of the current user, you've got this for in, and you've got the for where you are building your own variable and starting to step through the item with your own increment. You can see on this, on the right hand side, where you've got an I loop plus plus, you're using there the increment to constantly move on the check and to see whether the for is still true. So you've got the for, the initial variable declaration, and the I loop is less than the variable, then I loop plus plus. So you've got everything in that little for check, and then it's guarding entry into the compound statement that follows. There's another type of compound statement which is called a switch statement. Here you can see this is a way of allowing us to build in something which you might actually think is very similar to the case statement within the SQL that we were looking at in the course last week. And so we've got a case statement which allows us to check to see whether or not each individual condition is true. So in this particular case, this would be, you can imagine this being put onto a case screen, onto the area screen, and it's allowing us to choose the particular item and then assigning the value to what it wants to be. Okay, we're going to be covering collections in some of the work that we will be doing a little bit later on, but we can see here that collections are used when we come on to with a for loop. Collections essentially is a type of object which contains name-value pairs, and there are objects which are associative arrays which name those objects, but typically the type of thing that you would be using would be the query string object and the form object to allow you to retrieve this information. This is in an ASP page. That's typically where they're used, and so consequently within inside things like the ERP X3 integration or within the self-service pages, that's why you would typically use this type of reference directly of the query string or the form. I'm not going to labor over the for values and form value functions because these are some things that are very important and they'll crop up on the internal scripting. They're commonly called collections, but really they're functions. It's just that they look astonishing like in behavior to the idea of functions, although you can't actually evaluate them in the same way. You can't do a for loop, or which you can within a normal collection. Okay, and the last thing that I should mention is that we can start to work with exceptions inside our JavaScript code. Now, I should encourage you each time you're writing your own JavaScript code, and here I'm using as my tool in my Visual Studio. So if I choose new file, I choose this to be a JavaScript file, choose here, right mouse click insert snippet. I've got the Sage CRM SDK installed, so I go into my snippets, Sage CRM client side and I look at, actually not client side, let's write an ASP page and we look at the basic page structure, you'll see that I'm using here try, catch, and finally try and catch and throw as well. These are mechanisms to allow us to work with errors, to deliberately test something. If this is the case, throw an exception, throw an error. Try, catch are structures which can be used within client-side code just as much as they can be used inside server-side code. But it allows us to test to see whether or not a particular item is in place, and you can see a check to see whether this is a type of company is being referenced or not. Throw is the way in which you can deliberately force an error to happen, and then that generates an exception object, which you then have a series of properties that you can use. Typically within an ASP page, I don't go around deliberately throwing errors. I just handle those with the try and catch methods that you can see here. Okay, look at we'll see that when we come on to the ASP pages, but that's one of the things. And we'll also look at the reuse between screens. I'm not going to mention this now because, frankly, we're just about run out of time, but we will be dealing with the idea of reuse between screens when we come on to looking at the client-side implementation of business rules in 2 lessons time. That I think is on the 1st of September. Okay, we're at the end of the session. Let's just see if anyone has got any questions. Let's see if anyone has managed to stay with me for such a long session. I know that this has been a very long session compared with the other ones that we've run so far, but let's see, are there any questions?